let's start in the NBA, okay? Because it's a weird draft. And drafts for me are always a bit weird, but it's amazing to watch, to see the life-changing moments of these players as they walk through this historic moment. But last night, usually, no matter what, when you're looking at an NBA draft and you look down the round one, you'll see Kentucky, Indiana, Kansas, UCLA, Villanova, all these players. But instead, right off the bat, two young players from the country of France. Two young players that we today are going to be learning how to pronounce their names. Zachary Rochechet. Is that how it was? Rochechet?
I think that's close.
Yeah. It's a bad French accent. And then Star. I don't think Star was very, Sar was not very hard to make into or mistake, which I certainly just did. But Wemby is the one that set this all off a year ago, okay? A Frenchman. He was known, though. I mean, I even knew about him. This 7-foot-plus guy that can handle from the outside and shoot threes. He's going to be the number one pick. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He's going to be the number one overall pick. This year, not so much. And so when I'm opening up the app last night to go, hey, we're going to have to talk about this tomorrow. Better know who's being drafted, why they're being drafted, all of that. Two Frenchmen go 1 and 2, and I looked at my wife and I'm just like, oh, great. Two Frenchmen. At least if we went, Kentucky kids, I could go, or UConn guys, I could be like, all right, I watched some of March Madness. We can make that work. But no. What are your guys' thoughts around the French invasion? And Seton made a point earlier before the show, over the last decade or so, outside of the U.S., the next biggest country to be as influential in the NBA has been France. But it doesn't seem that way. Luka Doncic being in the NBA Finals this year. You have Giannis. You have all these foreign players who have led to possibilities of championships, have led front office people to really do their due diligence and see that they can. Not only are we a local brand where we're at, NBA basketball, frankly, for as much as it's maybe dissipated in the minds of someone who loved NBA basketball in the 90s, in the 2000s, is a global brand now. And that's the ultimate story here. It is everywhere, and it's why the NBA draft was so influenced last night by foreign-born players.
And that's what really stood out last night. It's almost like the past 30 years of changes of basketball all played out last night. You could go back in the past 25 years, and there's been drafts where the number one pick, you're like, I don't know much about that guy. Kwame Brown in 2001 or Andrea Bargnani in 2006. Markelle Fultz, he barely played in college out in Washington. You saw him a little bit. But last night felt like you got two French players who really can't watch them play full games unless you turn on NBA TV and some FIBA game at 2 a.m. And then there's a G League guy. And then there's a guy from Croatia. And then there's a Kentucky guy. You're like, oh, I know him. And then there's a couple of UConn guys. Like, oh, I love them because I saw them play deep in the tournament for a couple of years. But it's so wonky that it's all over the place.
And it's this is a learned thing for me, as I assume it was for you guys. You guys are much more, I think, invested in the NBA. You talk about it a ton on the show here with Dan. Last night, usually placed in kind of the background noise, but Seton, you told me a little something before the show around the idea of no matter what, no matter how much you were invested in maybe watching it, all of a sudden you're pulled in because these are kids and their parents who may have come from nothing and now are going to experience the most amazing opportunity, and that happens last night.
Yeah, it's almost like Hard Knocks, where the team doesn't actually matter because the storylines are kind of always the same and they're always compelling.
Yeah.
But we were talking yesterday about how much of the draft we planned on watching, and most of us were kind of like, well, I'll watch some. And then you end up, I get sucked in, and I don't know if it's because I'm getting, my age or because I'm a father or what it is, but I just you just watch these kids one after the other. Their name gets called, they're hugging their parents, they're hugging their siblings or whoever, their coaches, their teammates, they get up there and you're like, God, this kid's dreams just came true. And you get to watch that over and over and over again. Like they did it. They started out as a kid trying to make something happen, and this is the moment when they do that handshake, they throw that hat on. They just made it happen. A lot of times we just look at these kids about, Or is it a reach? Were they drafted too high? Were they that or whatever? And there's a certain humanity to it that is really powerful of just, on a personal level, like, dang, they just did it. You made it.
Yeah, and it's the analyst's job to do that, right? To wonder if they were this high or that. It's our job as the consumer, as a dad, like you said, as a person, as a human being, to look at it with some humanity and go, wow, what an amazing thing. And then the relatability for me, just to think about it, like, no matter how much people want to throw on the heap of what the draft means to them in reference to me, like, that day is the greatest day of my sporting life. Like, everything that I had ever worked for in my life led to that moment with my family who had sacrificed so much. So to your point, it's exactly what it should be. And that's why the NFL draft, any other draft out there, is so compelling to watch.
And there is almost, you can say, I know I say to myself too, like, anything that happens from this point is different than this moment right here. Is like, there is a certain pinnacle to that moment. Like, if nothing else ever happens in your life, you did this.
Yes.
You made this happen, and that's enough.
I'm hosting the Dan Patrick Show 26 years later because I got drafted second overall, right? I mean, no, don't get me wrong. There's been a lot of in between there. But, this draft was interesting for many reasons. And I think there's been a bit of a resurgence, and we're gonna get into that here when we come back. The big men. My biggest takeaway from the Celtics game that night I went to was how much longer and bigger they were than everybody, and the rebounds. And we saw a couple teams step outside a bit of the norm and maybe grab a player that isn't going to be out there on the perimeter, spreading the field, spreading the floor and making three-pointers, all right? We talked about that. Last night, round 1 of the NBA draft, I wanted to get into this because there were 2 guys taken early. One taken, I think, a lot earlier than people expected, and Zach Edey out of Purdue. He goes top 10, 7'4", right? I mean, he played for the national championship, a dominant force in college basketball for years, 300 pounds. I mean, this is in the vein of the Shaqs, right? The immovable object out there that can get you rebounds and all this stuff. But that's not what exists in the NBA anymore, right? It's about spacing. It's about movement. It's about 7-footers, Wemby, a la last year, who can handle the rock on the perimeter, can get to the hoop, or if you got a guy lacking in defense, sit there and pop threes over the top of their head. Zach Edey, Castle or Donovan Clingan from UConn, not those guys. Right? Those guys are, 12 points, 14 rebounds type of guys in the paint. That doesn't exist. The biggest takeaway I had from that Knicks-Celtics game was how much longer the Boston Celtics were. They were bigger. They were longer. They out-rebound the Knicks by, it was like 20 rebounds. They had more second and third chance opportunities at the buckets. And that for me is huge. Brad Stevens has kind of put together a roster that everything clicks and works for this organization right now. It's why they just stomped through the playoffs, had the best record in the NBA during the season, dominated. That's what teams are looking at. It's a copycat league no matter where you look. NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, it doesn't matter. So both of these guys go to teams that are, kind of not necessarily in the place where people are going to be seen, but DeAndre Ayton's in Portland, but it's a guy that can get you buckets, right? He can get you rebounds. If you get 2 or 3 or 4 a game, those are the types of things you're adding pieces to it. But are they worth first-round draft picks in a lottery draft?
Yeah, I was watching the coverage last night, and Jay Billis was really breaking this down well. And he says, everybody wants a 6'9" swing man who could shoot the three and who's very long. That's the goal with all these draft picks. And then they asked him, why would you take a Donovan Clingan who doesn't shoot threes, or Zach Edey who never shoots threes and is a true back-to-the-basket guy? Mm-hmm. He goes, they're extremes. They're really tall, not just like tall. They're like extremely tall. And you can't match up against them. So if you're playing against Zach Edey, you don't have, who are you going to put on him? A 6'9" power forward? So it's like an extreme matchup nightmare for the teams. He goes, analytically, it doesn't make sense because you're trading 2s for 3s. But these guys are a little bit different because they're true shot blockers.
And the idea of having those extremes may be limited to 1 or 2 players, and those are lottery available guys. with Klingon at UConn, he's a winner, right? He's won. He's played a ton. He's been coached hard. All the things that you don't have to worry about him. You bring him in. You the same with Edey. You have a situation where the guy played forever, stayed in college to keep doing what he was doing, and now is going to enter in a state where you're not going to have to ask much from him, right? They're going to ask him to be in there and be a defensive presence, to rebound, and to kick out to the shooters when he needs to. Marv, you got something on that?
Yeah, and I definitely think Ja Morant comes back for the Grizzlies this season after being out all the last year. And I think that helps a ton because the NBA is a lot of high screen and roll. And how are you getting around Klingon and Zach Edey? Those dudes are enormous, and I've seen Klingon in person. It's like, no, he's like super duper tall. Not like, oh, you're kind of tall. No. You're tall next to tall people. And so he's a legit 7'2". And so it's a whole different thing. And like you were saying, he might be one of those guys where it's like high screen and roll, catch the alley-oop. And that's all you need him to do because the NBA, you're surrounded by shooters, hopefully, in this NBA game.
Yeah.
In today's game, at least.
It's when you meet a person that tall, there's a freakish nature to it. Not in a bad way at all. It's just, whoa. Like that has to be an absolute problem if anybody's trying to get up a shot anywhere near that individual. And it was. I mean, there's a reason why Purdue was in the Final Four and then ultimately the national champ every single year. Like, no matter how good of a team that came up against them, he was such a difference maker throughout his career that any coach out there was looking at a opportunity to do the same. So both those guys go very high, unexpected in terms of what the analytics of what this day and age's NBA looks like. The Lakers, they get a player that I think a lot of people didn't expect to fall to 17.
Yeah, he was ranked 7th on a bunch of different boards. Definitely lottery pick. Dalton Connect out of Tennessee. He bounced around. He played in the Big Sky. He averaged 21 points in the Big Sky, but then he went to Tennessee last year, led the SEC. The pre-draft analysis said this is the best all-around scorer in the draft. And if you look at him compared to like Reed Shepherd from Kentucky, Reed Shepherd looks like he's a teenager. Dalton Connect looks like a man.
Well, he's 23.
Yeah, and the physicality is quite different. And if you look at the Lakers, they don't need a project. They need a good player now.
And playing in the Big Sky ages you 10 years at least. It just
right?
does, yeah. Especially in the northern Colorado, Seton.
It's crazy what a great year could do for you, though.
Hey, you're looking at him.
You
all
know?
right, I get it. Like, you go out and have a career year, especially in the SEC. I mean, in front of the eyeballs of everybody out there. If there are players that are going to be taken in this draft, right? It's guys from the SEC. It's the blue bloods of Kentucky, Indiana, UConn, UCLA. That's where those guys go. The biggest thing for me here is that on a team that the Lakers are hoping, of course, that LeBron that he opts into his contract, right? And doesn't opt out and look into free agency or re-signs on that deal. If so, you have a guy that comes in and is ready to go, right? It's not a developmental player. And the fact that they were able to get him at that, I think opens the door for what many believe at 55 could be an opportunity to do what I don't, which is one of the most amazing things in the world, to play NBA basketball with your son. That is a possibility because they got Connect, who is going to be able to go. He's going to be able to spot up on the outside and be the guy, especially if they have to make some moves. Austin Reeves' name has been bounced around in terms of what that means. This is a big deal for the Lakers. I think it is. For them to be able to get him at that spot was a real big win for the Los Angeles Lakers last night. The Spurs, Greg Popovich just keeps on going and going and going. They go and get a guard. They get Castle out of UConn, and he played for Dan Hurley, who was very demanding, and he goes to a coach in Greg Popovich who can coach him hard like he can and knows he's going to get a lot. And then a few picks later, all of a sudden, all the analysts on NBA TV and ESPN and everybody were watching, they go and get Dillingham. And they're like, whoa, like this is perfect, a shooting guard, a point guard. Wait, boom, hang on, someone's in my ear. They've just traded him to Minnesota for a 2031 draft pick. I mean, it's rare that you get a bunch of analysts that agree on something and go, oh my God, like This is the Spurs have done it, right? They've got Wemby. Now they got these two, bookends to help through that. This is great. And then how do you put Sugar back on that top? Like that's great too for a 20. I mean, they know what they're doing. Don't get me wrong. There's a reason for everything, but it sure looked like it was the right fit in the moment. Yeah.
It was such wild TV last night because if you're a Spurs fan, like we got Castle of UConn. We know that guy. He was crushing it all during the postseason.
Yeah.
And then we got this guy who's a shorter guard, a true point guard, a speedy guard like De'Aaron Fox, Rob Dillingham out of Kentucky. And like you said, they were glowing on the set. Like,
Yes.
they solved their backcourt problems for the next 10 years with Wembanyama, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden you hear Malik Andrews go, oh, excuse me? He's actually going, he's not going to go there. He's going to Minnesota.
He's going to Minnesota. And now you have to flip that around and go, oh my God, that's huge. Anthony Edwards now, Karl Anthony Towns. I mean, this is a team that everybody was so hot for in the playoffs that got dominated, at the end there, but they're up and coming. So now you add a player with that type of speed, and you're all of a sudden flipping around, and go, what did San Antonio do? They had it right there, and now they handed it off.